Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Obituary Writing as Ministry. A conversation with Chicago Tribune reporter Bob Goldsborough. Bob Goldsborough is a freelance journalist for the Chicago Tribune. He writes obituaries of local luminaries and reports on celebrity real estate transactions. Bob is also a local historian, particularly of Wheaton, Illinois, where he was raised and where he lives now. He offers presentations on Wheaton's architecture and its notable citizens. All right, so I'm just going to start by saying you, Bob Goldsborough, and I met over the phone when you were doing the news obituary for my Rabbi Emeritus at my congregation,
right.
as Rabbanim Niles Township. That was in the winter.
It was.
And during that conversation, we were just chatting about I write eulogies, you write obituaries, and I said we should just start a podcast. And you said that's a good idea. And then we didn't talk for like 6 months, but I started the podcast.
So I commend you for your initiative, and it was and remains a great idea.
Thank you. And this is number 10. This is podcast of Unveiling Death number 10. So it seems appropriate that where the idea germinated in a positive way, it's kind of coming to some fruition here at the 10th episode of Unveiling Death. So I thank you for that. And so you write for the Chicago Tribune, you write news obituaries.
I do.
And those are obituaries, those news stories, or journalism about local luminaries, if you could say that?
Yes, you can.
Who died.
Sure. Yes.
You also write about celebrity real estate transactions, people who've transitioned into beyond life, and people who are transitioning their venues where they're living.
That's correct.
So I'm wondering, I think about a house, and you are very deeply invested and interested in, as a Wheaton historian, architecture expert, particularly of Wheaton, where you grew up and where we're sitting right now. You talk about these homes like they have personalities.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's a similarity the way you approach a life that is complete and a history of a home.
Absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
If it's an older home, or even if it's a newer home, but it's had an interesting owner in the past, I like to focus on that. I like to surface information that isn't necessarily widely known or publicly known. Right. There's a landmark home in Glen Ellen that sold just a couple of years ago, and there had been a Depression-era labor union bombing at that house, and it was completely forgotten about. It took place in the Depression. Nobody knew about it. I figured out who the previous owners were, and I was stunned to find that home had been the site of a bombing that made the news. Somehow, over the ensuing decades, that was lost to history, and being able to surface that was incredibly satisfying because it helped add some layering or texture. It's not a pro-union or anti-union kind of thing, but it's more just an interesting thing that gives the house sort of some more texture to it.
It gives the house a story.
Very much
really.
so. Very much
so. And you put it in the context of history, of course. And you recently wrote a obit on Bill Logan, Evanston's first black police chief, and that was fascinating, actually. I mean, you're telling the story of a man who had an incredible life, incredible successes, and it's all in the context of history, Evanston history, and probably American history too. So that was really fascinating. I'm also wondering, if you had not. I assume that you were sort of as a kid, interested in stories and people and maybe history as well, or is this something that developed as an obituary writer? How did you feel qualified, in a sense, when you first started doing obit writing, to do that?
That is a wonderful question. So I wasn't always interested in taking care of somebody's life and someone's past necessarily, even when I got started in journalism. So no, when I started, I actually didn't even have a template for how to create an obituary. But I was always interested in journalism and in information and facts, getting facts right. And I also really like the idea of putting together a puzzle or a story. And whether it's the real estate or the obituaries, I like putting pieces together, and sometimes they don't fit. Most of the time they do. But I enjoy putting the pieces together, and I find it enormously, just intrinsically satisfying when I've completed that process. And so that, now of course, when that happens, I'm ready to move on to the next one too. But it is, for me, putting those pieces together and getting the answer, solving that, is really satisfying.
Right. But it's also, as we've discussed, more than just the pieces, it seems like, at least your approach to obituaries. And I'd like to quote from one of your articles when you quoted a colleague of the Chicago lawyer George Saunders. And George Saunders, who died, and you were writing about him, his colleague said, George's approach to practicing law centered on story. In every case, he wanted to be sure that we told the client's side of the story, and it had to be truthful and complete. And when I read that quote that you extracted from this particular interview with this colleague of George Saunders, I thought that's how you approach your stories. And it's not just the truthful and complete parts. That's like putting the pieces together. That's getting the facts right. But it's also the story, like George's approach to law centered on story. And that's what, seems to me that's what you do with your subjects.
It is. I realized something years ago. So before I was with the Tribune, I spent time interning at Channel 2 in Chicago, working for an investigative reporter who's now retired, Pam Zeckman. And I know when you do an investigative piece, sometimes it can be confusing. You get some information, and what I loved that Pam did is sometimes she'd just stop and she'd say, "What's the story here?" And I have always carried that with me, and I still carry that to this day. And sometimes, even, in the last week or two, in working on an obituary, I've stopped and I've said to myself, wait, what is the story? What am I trying to give the reader about this subject? What is it about this subject that a reader should know? What's the most important thing about this person? The phrase takeaway, people didn't use takeaway when I was in high school, but they use takeaway now. What's the takeaway from the story? What should that be? And usually that's really what I think George Saunders was trying to do. You put together a story, something you can communicate, in his case to jurors, in my case to readers, but the idea that, okay, there was something useful and interesting to know about this person that makes this person more special than any other person who passed away that day.
I'm really intrigued by this, your approach to story. You have your sources, I assume most immediately, family members, friends, colleagues. So they might have an idea of the story of their loved one's life, the loved one who had just died. But you might be researching and find that the story is something different. And yet you also don't want to write anything and publish anything that would really contradict their understanding of the life that they have just lost, of the person that they're mourning.
It is a delicate balancing act because, yes, I don't want to harm the grief process. I would hate to do that. And that's, every obituary writer should be careful not to do that. But by the same token, you're right, families are not always the best witnesses or the best sources. What I have found in some cases is that family members actually don't have all the information, the pieces that you were talking about. And so I'll find that and then present that to the family. I'll say, hey, I found this. You said Grandpa Fred graduated from Northwestern University. Northwestern has no evidence or record that he went there. And families rarely dispute that. They accept it, but they don't know. But then in terms of the story, that's where it gets more interesting, because I'll talk to the family, then I talk to people outside the family, and then what happens is I'll try to put together an understanding of, okay, how do I calibrate what the family's told me with what others have told me, with the impression that I'm getting as well.
Right.
And so that can be a bit of a delicate balancing act, because I don't want to cause families pain. My one exception for that, and I stick to this, is if someone has spent time in prison. A lot of families of Chicago politicians, and we know many Chicago politicians spend time in jail, we can't leave that out of a story. They were a public figure. There was a lot of news media coverage. So that's my one absolute, and there are probably some others if I were to think about them. But for me, the really important thing with family is this idea that, okay, we don't want to do any harm, but on the other hand, we want to accurately capture what the person did and put it in the proper context. And in doing that, We have to include sometimes some messy things. But all of us have had disappointments in life. So if someone was fired from a job, we don't have to say they were fired. We can just say they left that firm. So we try to be careful to really to not make the story messier than it needs to be. But by the same token, like I said, there are certain absolutes
that you can't ignore.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah. Do you think most of your fellow news obituary writers around this country have the same approach? In other words, would they all pretty much say, like, if someone went to jail or something significant like that, it's got to be in there?
Unquestionably. It's a fraternity of sorts, and I've dialogued with others where a family of a politician will put out their own family death notice through the funeral home, and the family will, of course, leave that part out. Most obituary reporters would say yes. I would say others that I know are even more hard-hitting than I am in terms of how they can communicate information about a person who has passed away. And it can cause problems. When Gene Siskel died, a colleague of mine wrote a piece about Gene Siskel, and it was a beautiful piece. Rick Hogan is the person I aspire to be like at the Tribune more than any other. But Siskel's family wasn't happy with it because he talked about the fact in the obit that Siskel loved horse racing and betting on horse racing. Family didn't like that being in there, and Rick noted that on the racing form that day, one of the horses racing was named Two Thumbs Up. Well, that's a terrific anecdote, and kudos to Rick Hogan for making that tie. That's the kind of thing every other obituary reporter reads and says, I wish I'd come up with that or done with that. And Rick does this all the time. He's the master at this. I mean, he's the one I aspire to be like. And Siskel's family took some offense at this. They wrote a letter. This is all public. They wrote a letter to the Tribune. They were very unhappy with that being included.
Wow. When you're consulting and trying to figure out how, what to leave in and what to take out, are you consulting with your editors or fellow?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes I'll go to my editor and I'll email him or call him and I'll just say, hey, I think we should mention this. I think we shouldn't mention this. But it's the final call is up to you. I'll do whatever you say, of course. So yeah, sometimes I consult with the editor. Sometimes I don't. But I will tell you, the longer I've done this, you always want to err on the side of more disclosure to your editors. It covers you every single time.
Right. Interesting. So, trying to get, in part, the differences between what you do and what I do.
Sure.
So with the eulogy, I want to be honest, but the facts are not so important. In other words, the conveying the vibe of a person, the spirit of the person, the complicated aspects of a person, they must be conveyed. Otherwise, people in the congregation that day will think that I'm talking about somebody else.
Certainly,
it's got to be real.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I don't have to say that that person went to jail, for instance, or some other big issue like that. I can leave that out. That's not a problem for me. It's not journalism.
Yeah.
But you're duty bound. I do. Yeah. It's almost more complicated for you, I think, because you're duty bound to make the puzzle pieces, the facts fit together.
Sure.
And that could be revealing some unwelcome truths, unwelcome by the family, but also honoring the person who died.
Absolutely. And I would say two things about that. One is family members sometimes, when I talk about the survivors, I mean, families are messy. In your line of work, you see it too. Family members are estranged or don't keep in touch. And I've had family members tell me to exclude a certain family member from the list of survivors. And so I feel duty bound. And that's the second point, is we're the document of record. I feel like a newspaper is a document of record. But also, I'm going to be gone from here 100 years from now. We all are. And hard to believe, but these printed ink on paper, some families will keep some copies of this in scrapbooks or journals, and they'll end up in attics, but someone will find it, and I just don't want to whitewash that. So if a fellow died, Charlie died, and his son Roy he doesn't talk to, the family will tell me, we'll leave Roy out. Or I'll say, did Charlie have any other children? And they'll say, well, he has another son, but he doesn't talk to him, so let's not include him. And I'll say, no, we have to include Roy. And they say, well, no, we don't like that. And I'll say, yes, but we're trying to be thorough. We don't want to cause any pain. And indeed, families have told me sometimes if you include Roy's name, that's going to cause Charlie's other survivors pain. It's really hard because I just don't believe in whitewashing. We also do that with divorces, believe it or not, because we're a document of record and because genealogists one day, I don't know when, may pull this out and look. It's very important to me that we come right out and mention, okay, Charlie was married and divorced twice, and then he was survived by his third wife. Families have trouble with that too. But again, those are some of the non-negotiables. And again, it's not so much, it is telling a story, but it's also providing the historical record as well.
Right. So you are a person of faith.
Yes, yes.
And in one of our earlier conversations, you referred to your obituary writing as a ministry of sorts.
Yes.
And that's amazing. I never would have considered that possibility. I mean, for me, writing eulogies is part of my ministry.
Absolutely.
It absolutely is. And it's a very important part of my mission as a rabbi. So talk about your obituary work as being ministry. And is it related to your faith?
Yes. So it's a wonderful question. It wasn't to start with. So I started writing news obituaries. I wrote my first one in 1993, but I really didn't pick it up as a beat until 2009. So earlier than that, I did a couple of one-offs. But I picked it up in 2009, and I didn't view it that way either. There was an old coworker of mine named Alec Lucas, who was a former pastor himself, who'd changed careers, and he characterized it that way several years in. I hadn't thought about it that way until he said that, but I did realize that absolutely it is. I'd agree with him. And also, I think my faith has deepened since 2009 as well. So as it has deepened, I think and I think it's natural for your faith to deepen. Part of that has been my empathy and my desire to try to see people, all people, no matter what their faith, the way God sees them. And so part of that, I think, has made it more the case where I try to write something that is appropriately honoring of the person who's departed, of the family members who are involved, and it means making certain allowances. I'm not as curt or abrupt maybe with a family that's grieving that I would be with a real estate agent for an article about homes, because that real estate agent has something to sell, whereas a family grieving, a lot of times they'll go off on tangents and share things that aren't necessarily germane to the story. But I think as much of that, I should note, some grieving families aren't always very nice either. Sometimes, and I've understood, and the empathy has led me to say, okay, if they're behaving that way, I mean, I'm supposed to let it roll off anyway. I'm a professional, and I'm used to getting doors slammed on me and phones hung up on me. But people who are grieving, the rest of us don't know what that's like, what someone who's grieving is feeling at that moment. And so I think it's important to have that empathy. And sometimes you just say, okay, if they're not ready to talk, they're not ready to talk. And I'll tell a family, okay, we won't do a story if you're not going to cooperate, because I have a firm belief that a family needs to cooperate for me to do these stories. Unless it's someone really famous, I don't think there should be a story written without their cooperation. But I think what my feeling is okay, if a family is not interested now, I tell them, let me know if you change your mind, and we leave it there.
Right.
But I think the idea behind it too is, I think what families sometimes do is they will they'll have a vision or a view for how the story ought to be, and they'll start telling me how I need to do the story. And because it's someone who's pushy, who's also grieving, I have to try to temper that. So for me, it's a bit of a balancing act to try to understand, okay, how to put together something that's optimal for all parties.
So I'm wondering, like, if you were to look back, not taking the names out of stories,
Sure.
and you look at a obituary that you wrote when you were a less faithful person, and you also look at a more recent one, but the names are removed.
Sure.
The only difference might be perhaps your writing style a little bit or whatever,
Sure.
but also a salient difference would be your own depth of faith.
Yes.
Do you think that you could detect that in your writing, in your obituaries?
That's a wonderful question. I haven't thought about that before, and I don't know. I think my earlier obituaries probably had more facts and less story. So I remember there's one obit I wrote in 1994, and I look back on it and I just cringe, because all I did was, toward the end, I listed just a ton of institutions and organizations that the gentleman was part of.
Right.
And so there wasn't much story there. I think there's more story now. So I think that's one of the pieces. And the question I ask every person now, when I talk to a friend or an associate, I say, what do you remember about this person? What made them special, and what did they excel at? I distinctly remember not asking those questions 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So I think that's one big difference. And the other is, again, I try to have more of a story than I used to. I don't know that I always succeed on the story part, but I'm certainly trying.
Right, fascinating. So one reaction I get from people who know that I write a lot of eulogies, because in my particular work as a rabbi, I'm a congregational rabbi, I just happen to do a lot of funerals as well.
Sure.
People that I know or knew, and people that I am just learning about posthumously.
Sure.
But people often will say, like, oh my God, that must be so depressing. And it's not depressing to me. And I'm wondering if you get that reaction when people learn that you are Bob Goldsborough, the news obituary writer for the Tribune. Do you get that?
I don't. I think I might have at one time early on, but it's weird. I don't get it that much. I was actually concerned about that. I was concerned that being in the business of death, I would find incredibly depressing. And the truth is, I don't. I actually find it a real privilege to be able to tell somebody's story. People's reactions, it's so interesting. People's reactions in the journalism world, they view writing obituaries as the lowest of the low.
Really?
You do that, and that is considered to be the bottom of the barrel in the journalism world. To which my reaction is, it is the one area, as long as we don't stop covering it, I can promise you we're always going to have an ongoing volume and pipeline of subjects.
Who's getting the last laugh?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. Journalists have historically viewed it as a beat that you quickly try to get away from. I don't see it that way. I think certainly at the New York Times and even nationally, obituary reporters tend to be older. So I'm actually young compared to most obituary reporters. But it's interesting, that across the nation, it can be at the New York Times a final place for people to go, but a lot of New York Times news obituary reporters love the work. They find it really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think some of it depends on your personality or your temperament. But it's weird. Yeah, I tell people that although I'm in the business of death, I don't actually dwell on the act of death all that much. I really use it as an opportunity to talk about people's lives. And what I find is when I'm done with that, you do get a lot of... I personally find it personally satisfying, but I think family members tend to be really appreciative. I got an email last week from someone who I had written his wife's obituary 10 years ago, and he had always wanted to write me a note and thank me, and then something happened that made him think that he should do so, and he did so. And I remembered his wife's obituary very vividly, and it was a real honor to write it because she did some amazing things. And so those sorts of things, well, that's not why you get into journalism. They're enormously gratifying.
Right. That's like what goes around comes around moment for you. I mean, you did justice to this woman's life by writing about her in an honorable way that her husband was grateful for, and then he turned around even a decade later and thanked you, and that was very validating for you.
He told me his family, he and his sons think about that obituary all the time, and it meant a great deal to them in their time of loss. She died young. She'd been a breast cancer. She'd really been an advocate for metastatic breast cancer patients. And I was just, really thrilled and that was unexpected. But it makes me realize I don't fully see the picture. And I guess this takes me back to my religious faith. None of us in our work ever sees the full picture of how our interactions with others are taken and accepted and reacted to and are internalized. When you hear something like that, it makes you realize, wow, this is a real privilege and it's a real responsibility. And so you have to do it and do it right. But not just writing it right, but also treating people right as well. So when they leave you, they remember their encounter with you. I'd hate for someone to think I wasn't fair, or I wasn't kind, or I wasn't empathetic or sympathetic, or that I wasn't just respectful of not just their lost love, their departed loved one, but also what they're going through as well.
Wow, awesome. So, the question that I ask at the end of these interviews: what song do you want to hear as you lay dying? And you can have two, because I think that you might have two. And if you have three, I'll let that go. I'll accept that as well.
I do have three choices. So one song is a Christian contemporary song by Matt Maher. He wrote it. It's called Your Grace is Enough. And the version I really like is the version by Chris Tomlin, sung by him. He's also a Christian contemporary performer. It talks about God's faithfulness, and it talks about using the weak to lead the strong. But most of all, it talks about heaven reaching down to us, which is a concept that I personally find very appealing. So I'm a big fan of Chris Tomlin. So another song of his would be Home. Home is the song that talks very explicitly about heaven, and it talks about us dancing on seas of amazing grace, and it talks about sorrows and sins being erased. And I think for anyone who's a believer, there's something really comforting to know that when we leave this place and ascend to heaven, that those sins, all the things we've done wrong, have already been paid for, but will be forgotten about and buried. But then the third choice, and this is an incredibly, I hope, unexpected for your listeners, is my final one, and that is the very popular 1983 song Rio by the Britpop band Duran Duran. So Duran Duran, far and away, they're my all-time favorite rock band. I've seen members of the band in one form or another something like 10 times. I've actually lost count. But Rio is such a fun and such a cheerful song, including its video, but it's also a song that's just fun for groups to sing along. So I just did a karaoke version of this song a few months ago with my family at my daughter's birthday party, and it was a blast. But because it's so uplifting and it's fun, it just feels like the kind of song that being ushered into the afterlife. It's the kind of song that I think I would want to have accompany me. So I realized,
her name is Rio, and she's dancing
on
in
the sand. That's right, just like that river twisting through a dusty land.
You might be surprised to learn that every one of my guests have said Rio by Duran Duran. Or maybe not.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
But maybe they will now.
Maybe they will. I hope so.
So, Bob Goldsborough, this has been really enlightening and a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being on Unveiling Death.
Jeff, thank you very much.
Thanks, as always, to my creative director, my editor, my son, Sammy Weil. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you're listening to right now, coming to Montrose Saloon on November 23rd. And thank you for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes, every other Monday.